Good afternoon. Welcome to the third module in the Penn Equity Institutes for Doctoral Students. My name is Sean Harper. I'm on the faculty here in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, where I also serve as Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Lori Patton Davis, who is a professor at Indiana University in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program there. This afternoon, Dr. Davis and I will be talking with you about using critical race theory and methods in your research. I want to start by first giving a little bit of background about the Penn Equity Institutes. We launched the institutes this past spring here in the Center for executive leaders in K-12, principals, school superintendents, and so on, as well as in higher education, college presidents, provosts, deans, vice presidents, and others, to help them figure out ways to bring a racial equity focus to their leadership work and into their agenda setting activities on college and university campuses. We decided here in the center to offer a series of 4 modules for doctoral students in the Penn Equity Institute series. These institutes are intended for doctoral students in higher education, student affairs, and community college leadership programs who wish to bring a racial equity focus to their research agendas. The first module last Tuesday was about some common approaches to studying race in higher education, and there were some critiques of those. The second module was a panel of very celebrated, very well-respected professors and researchers in the field, Estella Ben-Simon, Sam Macias, Sylvia Hurtado, Julie Park, and Susan Johnson from Lumina Foundation. Today, we decided to focus specifically on critical race theory as one approach to bringing a racial equity focus to one's research agenda. So this particular module is derived from a chapter that Lori and I co-authored with Jessica Harris, who at the time was one of Lori's doctoral advisees at Indiana University. That chapter is published in Ana Martinez Aleman, Brian Pusser, and Estella Ben-Simon's newest book, Critical Approaches to the Study of Higher Education. That book was published this past spring by Johns Hopkins University Press and is available on the website for the press as well as on Amazon and other online retailers. So today, Lori and I are going to talk through the chapter that we wrote with Jessica, which was really about using CRT to reinterpret widely studied topics related to students in U.S. higher education. Specifically, here's what Lori and I will do in this module. She will kick us off with providing an introduction to critical race theory. She will talk a bit about what CRT is, where it came from, and so on. And I will follow up by talking about what critical race theory is not and some common misapplications and misuses of CRT. We will then go into giving some examples from the chapter in our book with Jessica in which we use CRT to reinterpret 3 commonly studied topics regarding college students in higher education. I will start by talking about college access and admission. Lori will talk about college student development, and she'll kick it back to me to talk about college student engagement. After that, Lori and I will invite you to post some questions for us, specifically some topics that you're thinking about in your dissertation research or in other lines of inquiry with which you're thinking about and with which you're currently engaged in your programs that are seemingly raceless. And we'll invite you to do that through our various engagement platforms. In a moment, I'll tell you what those are. But she and I will help you think about whether or not CRT might be a useful frame for racializing those seemingly raceless topics. And at the end, Lori will conclude by walking us through what I believe are 9 ways to move toward a critical race research agenda. So it will be a set of closing statements that I think will nicely capture much of the content that she and I have shared with you throughout this module. As has been the case with the other modules in this institute, We want you to be engaged actively throughout our time together. This will not be 90 minutes of Lori and me just talking to you. We want to talk with you. So we encourage you to post questions, reactions, and comments through Twitter at Race Equity Ed, which is the Center for the Study of Race and Equity's Twitter account, as well as on Facebook. Our Facebook account is at Race Equity Ed as well. Wilman Christian, who is the Center's Director of Administration, will be fielding questions for us on Facebook and Twitter. So occasionally, Lori and I will take breaks and ask Wilman if there are any questions that have been posted via those two platforms. An additional platform, most of you are tuned in through Google Hangout. Google Hangout has a chat function, and we invite you to post your questions and comments there. Dimitri Morgan, who's a PhD candidate here in higher education and a research associate in the center, will be fielding questions via Google Hangout. I'll stop here for a moment and invite Dimitri to offer some instructions for those of you who choose to post your questions and comments via Google Hangout.
Hi everyone. So on the right-hand side of your screen, if you're looking at, if you're viewing this through Google Hangouts, you'll have a sidebar with a green button at the bottom that says Ask Question Here. If you click on that button, it will open up a text box where you can type directly into the text box to ask your question, and then click Submit Your Question. And then it will pop up into the question stream or the chat stream where I'll be reading. Carlos Santos Coy has a great suggestion. If you you can add the +1 function if somebody writes a question that you also have. That will help me know that that's a question that a lot of people would really like asked, and that will also help clear out some of the clutter to make sure that we're getting to the questions that a lot of people have in a timely fashion. But please feel free to address your questions in the chat box, and I'll be sifting through and starring questions as well as selecting questions that I will read to both Professor Patton Davis and Professor Harper.
Okay, thanks, Dimitri. So again, we invite you throughout our entire time here to be actively engaged through the variety of platforms that we're offering. We're going to go ahead and have Lori start us off by giving a quick overview of critical race theory.
Okay, so I don't know how quick I'll be. I'm going to try to be conscious of time, but it's hard to kind of cover critical race theory in 3 minutes. So I'll start off by saying that when we think about critical race theory, one important way to view it is as a lens or a tool for advancing a more complicated understanding of the structural inequalities that exist and inequities that exist, and then the material consequences that disproportionately affect racially minoritized populations. I would also add, and this is also from the chapter, that critical race scholarship is one effort to unveil both the hidden and overt nature of racism and white supremacy, and to consistently disrupt racist knowledges. In terms of the roots of critical race theory, it stems from the field of law and has over the years grown and spread. So there is critical race theory in education, and it also appears in other fields and disciplines. Matsuda, Lawrence, Delgado, and Crenshaw are 4 legal scholars who in the early 90s sort of wrote up the first set of tenets that describe critical race theory. And from that time, you see different iterations in the literature, but what I'll explain primarily comes from what they wrote in 1993. And so they talk about critical race theory as a movement of scholars, educators, and activists committed to confronting racism and white supremacy. And I think it's important that listeners understand that critical race theory isn't just theory, quote unquote, but it actually is a movement to sort of change how we think about race and racism, how we understand it, and how it operates and how it affects people's lives. Second, critical race theory acknowledges the endemic nature of racism And when we talk about endemic, I think the best way to understand it is that it's everywhere. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about racism as normal. But basically, racism sort of permeates every social system, whether it's education, politics, you name it. Racism and white supremacy is there. And it's so deeply embedded that it often goes unnoticed, in particular by those who are least affected by racism, or feel they're least affected by racism and white supremacy. And perhaps those who have strongly bought into the system of racism. Third tenet is that critical race theory challenges claims of neutrality, objectivity, and color blindness. So the belief that all people have a fair chance, for example, to attend college if they simply work hard, when in reality it takes much more than working hard. There are a lot of different factors that are sometimes beyond an individual's control that sort of shape their opportunities to experience college. Claims of neutrality and color blindness there are attempts to sort of dismiss that racism exists, or to deracialize attempts made to remedy historical injustices. Critical race theory disrupts ahistoricism and insists on a contextual and historical analysis of structures. So it's important to have an awareness of history and the fact that how we understand history is often shaped and misreported to celebrate those who are the oppressor or in positions of privilege and power. The fifth tenet centers the experiences of communities of color. So when a lot of literature on critical race theory focuses on counter storytelling and offering counter narratives, because these are more authentic and unique ways of not only representing communities of color, but acknowledging that they bring certain knowledges and understandings and histories to the table that often go unrecognized in mainstream literature and mainstream discourses. Sixth tenet is that critical race theory promotes interdisciplinary knowledge. So we know that it came from legal studies and the legal field and has found its way into education. But broadly speaking, when you look at the foundation of critical race theory, you see aspects of sociology, philosophy, ethnic studies, and so on. I think the final point I'll make about this is that CRT has emerged not simply as a form of race scholarship, but again, a movement that's committed to dismantling racism, classism, poverty, gender discrimination, and heterosexism. So when we think about racism, it's not enough to just think about race. It's also important to consider how race intersects and how it works in concert with other forms of oppression. Within critical race theory, there are three terms or concepts that have gained, tremendous popularity over the years. That's intersectionality, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, the Whiteness is Property thesis offered by Cheryl Harris, and then interest convergence, the interest convergence principle introduced by Derek Bell. So I'll briefly review these three concepts. When Crenshaw talked about intersectionality, what she was referencing was the operation of identity politics, particularly how overarching systems of oppression and domination collude and create uniquely disenfranchising experiences for individuals who are situated at the crux of multiple marginalized identities. And so I want to clarify, because I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding about intersectionality. It's not that only certain people have intersectional identities, but it's about the consequences when marginalized identities come together and what the circumstances that result for particular populations. When Crenshaw wrote about intersectionality, her goal was to acknowledge the experiences of individuals who get quote unquote theoretically erased. And she talks about the need to acknowledge diverse forms of oppression and their mutually shaping nature on identity politics. And so in addition to thinking about identity at the micro level, she talks about intersectionality as it plays out on the macro level. So not just thinking about how one's individual identities intersect, but how systems of oppression intersect and create these social hierarchies of power that strip the humanity and agency from some groups and then, you know, lift other groups up. The second concept is whiteness as property, and I mentioned that was introduced by Cheryl Harris in 1993, and she talks about 4 property functions of whiteness: the rights of disposition, meaning the ways in which the law allows for white skin, or the property associated with white skin, to be transferred from generation to generation. So when we think about the law, one's racial identification isn't something that would typically be transferred, but by simply being born white or being born and perceived as white, that's a disposition that white people have. And so without white skin, you wouldn't have a right to disposition. The right to use and enjoyment. So this particular function is about the capacity of whiteness to be both experienced and deployed as a resource. Reputation and status property. So this is about an outward manifestation of whiteness, and so it acts as a resource to define who is worthy of personhood. So if you are white, you are fully human. And if you're not, then your identity is called into question. Being white confers individuals with benefits. So being able to maintain your status in a racial hierarchy, being perceived as trustworthy, and garnering respect without really having to do much of anything except be white. The fourth property right is the absolute right to exclude, and it involves the power to decide and the process of determining not only who is white, but also who is not white. And so in terms of property, whiteness is considered a valuable commodity. And again, as I mentioned before, to be white is to suggest an existence of a pure racial identity. And it results in this value and exclusivity of whiteness that others can't access. The third term is interest convergence, introduced by the late Derek Bell. And Bell argued that the racial advancement for people of color was inextricably linked to serving white interests. And so, plainly stated, white people will tolerate the advancements for people of color only when white interests are ultimately served. And when you think about interest convergence, it's important. So I think a general understanding might suggest that, okay, for example, black people want rights, and a law was passed to sort of put a law in place to allow African Americans to exercise a particular right. But what Bell is talking about with interest convergence is that, yes, sometimes interests do converge, but those with less power often get disenfranchised when those interests converge. And those in power can leave or decide that they're no longer interested at any point in time. So it's not as if interest convergence is some sort of compromise, because ultimately what Bell is suggesting is that those who are oppressed, minoritized, racially disenfranchised, don't stand to significantly benefit.
Okay. Thanks, Lori, for providing what I think was a really clear and very accurate presentation of CRT. I failed to acknowledge that it's because of Lori that I was introduced to critical race theory. She and I both, for over a decade now, have been using critical race theory in our scholarship. So I remain indebted to her for introducing me to this very powerful lens through which to interpret the racialized findings in my work. And thanks for that, Lori. Dimitri, do we have any questions from Google Hangout?
Yes, we do. The first question is from Esmeralda Hernandez Hamad, and the question is, are there ways that we use critical race theory to do research inherently qualitative in nature? In other words, is there no room for quantitative research in CRT? I think that's an interesting question because much of the work on CRT that we see is qualitative. So I'm curious for what you all think about that.
I believe there. Oh, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Okay. From my perspective, I think there's plenty of space to use critical race theory to inform quantitative research. But I think that someone who is engaging in quantitative research has to understand that some of the assumptions of quantitative research are directly in contradiction to CRT. So quantitative research is often perceived to be objective, and you know, critical race theory is purposefully and explicitly, you know, in many ways subjective, or, you know, is pushing researchers to acknowledge the inherent biases and issues that shape how they ask questions, what questions they ask, how they shape a survey. And so it's not just about conducting the research, but sort of how the researcher enters into the process of research.
Yeah, Lori, I think that's really a great point. In our spare time, you and I should probably co-write a piece on critical race quantitative analysis. I think that could be really useful to people. We have a faculty affiliate here at the center, Ezekiel Dixon Roman, who was just in the center yesterday, and we were talking about doing an in-person institute here next spring for critical quantitative researchers. And it would be really interesting to help them think about not only how to use certain methods, but also how critical race epistemologies could be useful in the design of future quantitative studies. Let's talk for a moment about what critical race theory isn't. Lori and I have identified at least 5 things. There probably are even more, but these are things that we see often when we're reading dissertations or when we're reviewing manuscripts that have been submitted to journals for which we serve on editorial boards and conference proposals and so on. Critical race theory is not sort of the go-to thing for all things related to race. We see time and time again, right, that there's been this sort of snowballing popularization, if you will, of CRT, and folks have sort of misunderstood it to mean if my study is about people of color or if it's at all about race, well, surely CRT is the analytical frame or theoretical frame that I should use. It's not that. You know, CRT comes with a set of both personal and epistemological commitments. It comes with a real understanding of its interdisciplinary roots and power. So therefore, it cannot and should not be just the popular flavor of the day that people throw into their research because it's somehow focused on race. Secondly, critical race theory is not entirely situated in education. Lori and I give major props to Gloria Latson-Billings and Bill Tate, who 20 years ago brought critical race theory to education in their landmark 1995 Teachers College Record article on a CRT of education. I don't think that Bill and Gloria intended for folks to only use the Latson-Billings and Tate piece to frame their studies on CRT, right? Their work very responsibly builds on the work from legal studies and, you know, prior, you know, critical race theorists who had done the foundational work. And I think that that's important. Lori and I often read things that only have education scholars cited in them, and that suggests to us that people have not developed an appreciation for the interdisciplinary roots and the ways in which critical race theory has been written about and advanced in other fields and disciplines. So we offer a cautionary note, right, to not just read secondary interpretations of what CRT is, and definitely don't just read stuff that's only in education. Critical race theory is not for those who choose to ignore structural forces, right? Because part of it is very much concerned with laws, policies, structures, and the kinds of structural norms that systematically disadvantage communities of color and individual people of color. It's not for folks who want to sort of slip into deficit-minded cultural interpretations of things like poverty or underachievement and underperformance among students of color in schools and so on. A real careful critical race analysis will attribute rightly the kinds of patterns of performance and so on that we see to structural determinants of opportunity. It's certainly not a fragmented collection of tenets and propositions. The two of us often see, again, lots of papers in which people will merely list the tenets of CRT that Lori talked about, and the other features of CRT like intersectionality, whiteness as property, interest convergence, and so on. And they won't connect those things throughout their analysis and at the end of their paper when they're making sense of their findings in their studies. So we encourage people to move beyond simply listing the tenets, but to think about how the tenets relate to each other, how they relate to the research questions that you're pursuing in your own work, and so on. And lastly, critical race theory is not personally disconnected and unreflective. So we see, again, a lot of people have sort of jumped on the CRT bandwagon and they throw it into their papers. And we don't feel a real sense of personal commitment to the philosophies and epistemologies that undergird CRT in the rest of the paper. So it seems that people have very conveniently sort of gone and just picked, sort of an analytical sort of tool off the shelf to dump into their papers. The architects and pioneers of critical race theory were deeply committed to justice. They were deeply committed to racial equity. They were deeply committed to privileging the voices of persons of color. They were deeply committed to deconstructing and dismantling white supremacy. So those kinds of commitments were so clearly reflective in the tone in which they wrote their papers and their books and so on. So again, we caution against, taking on CRT in a way that is that feels disingenuous and not reflective of those commitments. Lori, do you have anything you want to add to those five?
I think you captured it all. That was good.
Okay. Will, any questions on Twitter or Facebook?
Sean, there are a lot of retweets going on, so let me just see what we have here. Yep, I did find a really good question. Okay. So I am looking at a Bashan HB. He asks, how would you apply critical race theory when researching the experiences of administrators of color that work in higher ed?
Well, Lori, I'll start. I think that one way to do that is to center one's analysis on their racialized experiences and on, more specifically, on how their experiences are shaped by encounters with racism, racist institutional policies, structures, and cultural norms within post-secondary institutions. CRT centers racism in its analysis. I would also say that CRT very much is about honoring the voices and the lived experiences of people of color. So, you know, the very focus on the experiences of administrators of color, I think as long as their voices are at the forefront of one's analysis, as opposed to, you know, some other thing, I think that would be helpful. Lori?
I agree. It might, doing a study like that might simply begin with asking the question of, you know, what does race have to do with it? So not simply that the participants or the individuals you want to study are people of color, but how does race and racism affect their work life, how they understand their positions within, you know, their office or department, and as Sean mentioned, you know, what are some of the policies or structural things in place that ensure that this particular group of people have a certain experience within their campus environment that primarily differs from their white counterparts. Might be one way of looking at it, but definitely centering their voices and hearing from them and being thoughtful about how they understand and make meaning of racism within their work environment.
By the way, Lori, this question was a really good one. It's a great research topic, by the way. So we've noticed that there's been quite a bit written about the racialized experiences of students of color, and quite a bit written about the experiences of faculty of color, but comparatively speaking, not a whole lot on administrators of color, particularly administrators of color in student affairs, administrators of color at community colleges, or even at minority serving institutions. So the field is wide open, I think, for more critical scholarship on the racialized lives and experiences of our administrator colleagues.
Right, and I think it would be the responsibility of the researcher to sort of not simply talk about, and this is, I think, what's been going on in the literature. There might be talk or findings that they experience racism, but not how they experience or, you know, how it plays out. And so more in-depth descriptions of how racism and white supremacy are experienced, I think, would be really helpful.
Good. Great. Dimitri, any questions on Hangout?
Yeah, can I ask two questions, because I think they're both really good.
Are they your own questions?
No, not my questions. Questions from the audience. So this one comes from Emily Sue. They ask, language often intersects with race in important ways. Language is used to cloak racism. How does or how might CRT be applied to non-English language communities, for example, immigrant communities or heritage non-English language speakers?
I think there are a couple of things that might be helpful. So earlier we talked about how, you know, critical race theory has, you know, grown within other fields and areas of study. But there are also, I guess, quote unquote, spin-offs of critical race theory that get more at different groups that get racialized. So there is Black crit, there is Asian crit, there's tribal crit. And when you think about issues of language, it tends to be with Latino populations and some Asian and Asian American populations. And so looking at the work that's been done in those areas, I think would be helpful. Another way, and for some reason when you were asking the question about language, I was thinking language in terms of discourse. So one methodology that might work well with critical race theory might be critical discourse analysis.
Right.
So, you know, how I don't know what the study is that this person was asking, but let's just say they were studying the the interactions between English language learners and faculty or something like that, or teachers. There might be a way to uncover sort of the hidden messages and discourses that shape those interactions. Although it's generally speaking about language, but sort of the underlying messages embedded in those interactions.
And I think I would just simply add, Lori, to go back and look at the legal scholarship to see how people who've used CRT in the law have used it in their intersectional analyses of race and poverty and language and opportunities, and how those things have shaped laws and policies in other disciplines. I think that could be very useful.
I think that's an excellent point, because a lot of people don't go back to the legal literature and look and see how those things have sort of unfolded in the law. That's a great idea.
And sometimes, right, it's not just going back. I know that you and I have advocated in this conversation for going back to the early work of CRT, and definitely reading the work of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado and others. That's important, but sometimes it's also going over to other disciplines, not necessarily going back, but just simply going over. CRT is widely used in other fields even now. So there may not be people asking questions about language, for example, and linguistic policies and so on in education, but they could be asking those questions in linguistic anthropology, in law, in legal studies, and so on. So sometimes we have to look over to other fields to get some guidance and useful examples there.
Great. And then the second question, really quickly, goes back to one of the points that that Lori was making. And so it's by Heather Mathers, and she asked, when considering CRT and the concept of whiteness as property, who is defining quote-unquote white, and how is that defined? Visually, self-identified? Not to go all Rachel Dolezal, but it is important to consider who is doing the defining when classifying anyone.
Ultimately, race is defined by the law, so from its construction within the law, it's sort of developed other unspoken rules around race. Technically, I guess by what you check on a form, that would determine your race. However, we make determinations about individuals' race all the time, and might virtually argue someone down about who we think they are. But the reality is that race is defined in the law, and I might I could say I'm white, but no one will believe me because there's a law that says that I'm not that I'm not white, and then behaviors that stem from that law also, suggest that I'm not white.
Yeah, and that law, by the way, Lori, for you, leads all the way back to your birth certificate, right?
Yeah.
From the moment you arrived, you were racialized. Mm-hmm. Lori was the one who turned me on to the Cheryl Harris 1993 article on whiteness as property. It really is foundational. And one of the most powerful arguments that Harris makes in the article is that white people get to choose who's white. They have the right to exclude. They determine the bounds of exclusion, right? So, yeah, we probably should move on now. All right, so I want to make sure that we don't run out of time, unless Wilman tells me that he has a super burning question from Twitter or Facebook.
Yes, I do. This is throwing it back to using CRT and looking at higher ed administrators. So we have a tweet from L. Jackson, 1908. She asks, using CRT, what are some ways to mitigate bias when interviewing participants, such as Board of Trustees or search committee participants or members?
Mitigate whose bias? The researcher's bias? I don't think you can mitigate bias.
Yeah, I feel strongly that there is no such thing as objectivity in any form of research. be it critical race research, be it qualitative research or quantitative research. Here's another plug for the critical approaches to research in higher ed. The book that I mentioned earlier by Ana Martinez-Aleman, Brian Pusser, and Estela Ben-Simon, there's a chapter in there that is talking about critical quantitative work. And, you know, by the very nature of the questions that we choose to put on a survey, for example, those questions come from, you know, some epistemological assumptions that the survey maker brings to the process. Even seemingly raceless data, like, say, census data or data from one of the U.S. Department of Education data sets, you know, those may seem to be sort of more objective. But even those, at some point, someone determined the kinds of questions that needed to be asked to lead to the data that make their way into those data sets. So, yeah, I don't think that bias, I tend to not call it bias, but to think of objectivity. I think that there is no such thing as objectivity.
And just to add to that, someone also determines how the data get interpreted.
Right. Yeah. All right, Lori, should we talk about our chapter in the book?
Sure.
All right, so I will start us off with just a little bit of background. Lori and I decided to, for this particular chapter, to take a small handful of commonly studied topics related to college students, mostly undergraduates, and to use CRT to reinterpret those topics. So I will start us off with college access and admission. In the book, we acknowledge how people who write about college access and admission, they often write about inequities without acknowledging higher education's racist history and how that history has manufactured and sustained those inequities over time. So in some ways, you know, the inequities are written about in a real-time way. Here's what's going on now that is blocking access to various opportunities in higher ed without thinking back to, well, wait, these things didn't just start. They are a byproduct of, you know, these racist policies and practices that have long governed institutions of higher education. So the ahistoricism function and tenet of CRT demands tracing contemporary access barriers to the colonial colleges. For example, a foundation built for white elites while Native Americans and Africans were being slaughtered in the name of nation building, right? So it's not just that predominantly white institutions have suddenly become exclusive. They were exclusive from the very start. Even when they were started, we didn't have access to them, right? So, and Native Americans and, you know, other minoritized people and people of color did not have access to those institutions. So using ahistoricism to sort of make sense of contemporary problems and access could really help advance the conversation on that topic. Another tool in CRT is Derek Bell's Permanence of Racism thesis. Derek Bell, as Lori mentioned, Gloria Ladson-Billings also has suggested that racism is normal, it's endemic, it's all around us. Bell, in his 1991 piece, also said that it's permanent. We now have enough confirmatory evidence across the lifespan of the United States of America to absolutely, undeniably confirm for us that we are stuck with racism, that it is permanent, it has always been a part of our country, we're never going to get rid of it. Now, Bell makes clear that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, you know, try our hardest to fight against it, to try to dismantle it, to try to call attention to it, bring about, you know, policy and structural changes to, you know, do what we can to lessen the effects of it. But racism itself is a permanent feature of the U.S. So therefore, in the higher ed literature, and more specifically in the areas of college access, that permanence of racism thesis is really useful in illuminating the long-standing exclusion of people of color from predominantly white institutions. Trends and practices that have persisted for centuries or at least the residual effects of them, are likely to be everlasting, right? So we read a lot of papers where, you know, people suggest that if you do 1, 2, and 3, you know, suddenly we will have racial equity. I don't believe that. I believe that, you know, again, that we're stuck with the residual effects of racism. But again, like Derek Bell and like other critical race scholars, I absolutely believe that we still should work our hardest to do work that advance justice and racial equity. Some other points that we make and some other examples that we give for how CRT can be used to reinterpret themes in the college access literature. So GPAs, high school transcripts, SAT or ACT scores, essays, recommendation letters, those things supposedly distinguish some applicants from so-called less qualified or less deserving others in competitive admissions pools. Not explored, though, are the characteristics in when I say not explored, I mean not explored oftentimes in the college access literature, are the characteristics, predispositions, assumptions, and racial socialization of those who set the parameters of access, right? Those who set the policies that determine the metrics by which students will be evaluated and deemed admissible or not worthy of admission, right? So, you know, CRT, as Lori mentioned, you know, really fights against these notions of colorblindness and meritocracy. So using that tenet of CRT to make sense of, you know, again, who are the admissions providers? Who are the people who are reviewing applications and making determinations? And, you know, again, what assumptions do they bring to the evaluation process is not a question that we've seen often answered and explored in the literature. So, you know, again, the CRT tenet suggests that merit is elusive, and colorblindness in an admissions process is unlikely, and perhaps even impossible. Going back to Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property, that concept could be useful in crafting additional questions pertaining to whites as architects, owners, and gatekeepers of racially consequential admissions policies and practices. We know for sure that the overwhelming majority of our colleagues who work in college admissions are white. People who set college admissions policies are white. So therefore, the various components of Harris's thesis could help us to sort of make better sense of how, again, there is white ownership of the admissions process because of the demographics of those who set the policies and enact the practices. I think we have just two more here that we offered in the book and in our chapter. So the interdisciplinarity of CRT will complicate commonly pursued access questions. So in the literature, there are these themes about the kinds of forces and conditions that either complicate or enable access for particular populations, right? So the availability of rigorous curricula in P-12 schools, the sufficient number of counselors in high schools where there are large concentrations of minoritized and lower income students, and abundant information about college in particular communities will produce some gains in college going rates among minoritized students who attend low resource high schools. So we're not suggesting in any way that, you know, our scholar friends and colleagues who have done important access work, that their work is somehow, you know, wrong, or that, you know, the availability of rigorous curricula is somehow suddenly unimportant. We're not suggesting that at all. Those things are important and they will produce some gains. But enrollment for people of color will continually lag. For example, if police profile and harass students of color during their daily commutes to and from school, if their families don't have access to high quality and affordable health care, if college counselors who work in high schools have racist implicit biases about who these students are, what their future is likely to be, so on and so forth. If college admissions officers refuse to visit the perceivably hopeless public high schools in which students of color, especially lower income students of color, are disproportionately enrolled, and if students of color see few faculty and other people of color during their campus visits, we will continue to see an enrollment lag among students of color. So the point here is that it's not just one thing, right? It is a convergence of forces and factors that help explain why we see such sluggish enrollment and matriculation and access patterns for students of color. Dimitri, before we go to Lori's section on student development, are there any questions on Google Hangout?
Yes, there are. So I'm sensing some uneasiness from some of our white colleagues, and I think it's caught in this question from Kizzy Jones Lopez. Excuse me. Is it ethical to use CRT as a lens to understand the experience of people of color if you are a white researcher?
Lori?
Okay. I've heard this question before. And it's interesting. So I had Adrian Dixon visit one of my CRT classes, and this question came up, and her response was that, you know, who is she to tell white people what they can do? They've been doing what they've been wanting to do for centuries now, so it's not up to her to give white people permission to use CRT. But I would say that I'm certainly not inclined to police who uses critical race theory. My concern is with the commitment of the individual. And so I think when Sean talked about what CRT is not, like I would be disappointed to see a scholar use it, a white scholar use it to benefit off of the experiences of people of color for, you know, research notoriety or to
Street
engage.
cred. Street cred.
Yeah, street cred. Or, you know, I think one of the ways to sort of offset that is to, as a white researcher, is to engage in that type of work with a person of color. I have often done that in my work that deals with lesbian, gay, and bisexual populations. The other piece, and I've seen some white scholars do exceptionally well with using CRT, and that would be the work of David Gilborn and Susan Iverson. And you know, you can read their work and tell that, okay, they get what critical race theory is, and that what they're writing isn't just about the scholarship, but you get the sense of a commitment or a hope that their work will make a difference for, you know, the reader, if it's an administrator or, you know, a policymaker, or whomever is reading, might read that work and better understand critical race theory and understand how racism, you know, plays out within a particular policy or post-secondary situation.
I certainly want to make sure that we make space for other questions that will emerge throughout this conversation, so I'll be brief. I will just simply say that we need more committed white scholars and graduate students and others to join in doing the very serious work for racial justice and for opportunity and for equity. We as people of color and as scholars of color absolutely cannot do it alone. But I think I'm going to go with Lori here that all we are asking for is some real authenticity and a real sense of commitment to doing the work responsibly and to doing it collaboratively. I am like Lori too, that it's not my place to police who uses critical race theory. I only ask that they do so responsibly. All right, Lori, do you want to talk about the ways in which we thought in the chapter about using CRT to reinterpret student development studies?
Yes. Okay. So if you are in a higher education and student affairs program, or if you have a master's degree in student affairs, you probably took a student development theory course. And as post-secondary educators, you know, our belief is that college is the space that facilitates students' development. But how we understand student development really has some racial implications if we consider the types of theories we use to inform our practice in colleges and universities. And so in the chapter, we talk about the endemic nature of racism and that, you know, it's not surprising to find a theory in which the majority, if not all of the participants are white. And that often goes unquestioned. And so it's normal to see a theory, all white participants, and we'll use that theory and apply it across the board to any student. And again, that doesn't really get challenged or talked about, but it certainly reflects the endemic nature of racism. And when we think about the way we position theories, so older theories are considered to be traditional and foundational, and it just so happens that the majority of those theories are written by white people, namely white men. But that sort of framing basically ensures that anyone who's writing a future theory, if it's to be validated in some way, they would have to reference these older theories that we know have some inherent flaws in them. And Delgado talks about this practice as imperial scholarship, where there's just a small contingency of scholars who have written work in an area, and you know they get cited over and over again, and in order for work that comes later to be justified or you know, respected, there's this citing that has to happen. I guess it's sort of a politics of citing individuals' work. The second aspect, the third aspect is that student development theories as a whole are colorblind, and that they really fail to deal with racism in racist context. So there are theories that focus on racial identity, but that's the only time, you know, race or, you know, students dealing with racism tend to come up. It has to be a specific racial identity theory. And when we think about racial identity theories, and I'll say, for example, Cross's theory of psychological negrescence broadly is perceived to be about Black people. And any theory or racial identity theory is perceived to be about that particular group, but it is too narrow for aspects of it to be used across the board. But the same is not true of these theories that have primarily white participants. And so there's a bit of a contradiction there. And so when we look at who writes student development theory, a huge majority of those scholars are white. And so you have to ask whose epistemological perspectives are being privileged, and then how those perspectives subsequently transmitted through publications and in course curricula, and then how do these perspectives emerge in the translation of theory to practice. So if we never talk about racism or the limitations of student development theory and their failure to really grapple with race and racism, then we're ultimately doing a disservice for those who are learning these theories and who believe that these theories are critical for their practice.
Great. Thanks, Lori. Will, any questions on Facebook or Twitter?
Sean, I've just checked. No new questions coming up, but lots of retweets, lots of conversation going on, lots of good points y'all are bringing up here.
Okay. Dimitri?
Yes. All right.
I feel like Dimitri always has something.
Right.
Well, I just have a lot of questions on the chat. All right, so this comes from Tamika Ferguson, and she asks, what do you suggest for using CRT appropriately in addition to other frameworks? For example, Black feminist thought or student leadership theory, qualitatively? And or what are your thoughts on the expansion of CRT to be more identity focused? So I think this question goes at the heart of, is CRT something that should be used alone? How should it be used with other theories, and how does a researcher carry that out in an effective and ethical and sensitive and authentic way?
Lori, do you want to take the first half, given that you do that so masterfully in your own work, using the CRT in combination with Black feminist thought and other frames? And I'll take the latter half about it becoming more identity focused.
So I think it's possible to use critical race theory as part of a larger lens for one study. It's really all about the researcher being responsible with how they write up the framework. So you can talk about critical race theory and its relevance for the research study and how it informs the study, but there need to also be clear linkages between critical race theory and perhaps some of the limitations of critical race theory, which would make an additional framework necessary. So critical race theory doesn't necessarily talk about leadership, but an individual doing a leadership study who uses a critical race lens might talk about leadership theories, talk about some of those limitations and the fact that they don't, acknowledge the role that race plays in leadership. So I just think it's about making clear arguments about how theories connect, how they support one another. Because while I am a huge fan and user of critical race theory, it has its limitations, just like any theory, and it's certainly subject to critique. And so in that regard, I think it's worth, depending on the topic, using critical race theory with in concert with other theoretical lenses.
And I'll just simply jump in and comment on the latter half. I would say about CRT being used sort of more to study identity, I think I would highly encourage everyone, again, to go back and read the foundational pieces on critical race theory to understand from where it came. There certainly is a role for people's identities and lived experiences, but it has to be placed in an analysis of structures and policies and so on, given, again, that it emerged in the law, right? Legal scholars were interested in people's lives insofar as they were also interested in understanding structures and systems that persistently disadvantaged those people. So I think approach. All right, I am going to shift here now and talk about very quickly here how in the book we write about college student engagement. The CRT tenet on the experiential realities of people of color could raise important questions about why some students may find engagement in some experiences unappealing. Not captured on surveys of college students are students' interactions with classroom environments in which they are the lone representatives of their racial and ethnic groups. So very rarely do we ask students, when we're asking them, how engaged are you in the classroom? There isn't a set of questions that also ask, how many people of your same racial group were in that class that you took in which you were disengaged, right? Nor do we ask questions about, where and whether the professor commits or permits racial microaggressions, or where the threat of confirming racial stereotypes is high, and classroom environments where all of the authors that they read in their classroom assignments are white. Like those kinds of questions could very easily help explain why some students are quantitatively and qualitatively much more engaged than are others. But we don't tend to ask those kinds of questions when we're talking about student engagement. The question is almost always about, why are blacks and why are Latinos and why are lower income Asian American and Native American students so disengaged, by only looking at, again, sort of their sort of quantified patterns of engagement without, considering these other structural forces. Also not asked are questions about students' inclination to get involved or engaged in campus activities that appeal exclusively to white cultural interests, or organizations in which white interests are protected through elections, investments, and agenda setting. We don't tend to ask those kinds of questions, right? We tend to stop at, well, students of color were not as engaged in student government, for example, as their white counterparts. Well, yeah, it's because there is a protection of white interest in student government elections, perhaps. We don't tend to ask those kinds of questions. We also, in the chapter, sort of raise some questions about common terms in the student engagement literature. One of them is around high impact educational practices. Now, to be sure, I'm absolutely not throwing shade at the National Survey of Student Engagement or its architect, George Koo, who was my doctoral advisor, who's been so supportive of me. Like, this isn't sort of throwing jabs at George or at Nessie, but there is a lot of conversation in Nessie and in other surveys like Nessie around, for example, high impact educational practices. So in the book, Lori and I suggest that being called a nigger or a wetback or an alien, for example, those are undoubtedly high impact practices. Imagine being called one of those things. You're absolutely going to be impacted by that. It is absolutely going to impact your experience in some enormous ways. We also argue that it is arguably educational when one is called these things, right? Or treated in ways that are racially harmful, because it teaches students of color about the realities of race and racism on campus and in society. So in that way, these kinds of experiences absolutely are high impact educational practices and experiences, but they're not acknowledged as such in the student success literature. Those things undermine success, but again, have not been thought to be high impact. Racial battle fatigue is a concept that William Smith at University of Utah uses in his work, and Christine Stanley, who is at Texas A&M, has written quite a bit about. And it's really the feelings of exhaustion that ensue among those who are constantly confronted with racism, racial stereotypes, and racial underrepresentation in predominantly white spaces especially. Well, racial battle fatigue may affect students of color in more consequential ways than would completing a senior capstone, right? A senior capstone experience or doing an internship in one's field, those are thought to be high-impact educational practices. Studying abroad, so on and so forth, right? But again, constantly being confronted with racism can be exhausting and could have a more consequential effect on student success and student engagement than some of those other things. So too could experiencing the denial and subsequent departure of the lone professor of color in one's department. Those can have significantly large effects on minoritized student outcomes. We've heard here at the center in our campus racial climate work, when we're on campuses and we're doing these focus groups with students of color, they talk about how the one advocate, the one role model that I had in my department didn't get tenure that affected me in some outrageous ways that ultimately, you know, affected my performance in my classes, my sense of belonging, and so on. The last thing that I'll share here is, again, as you could tell, I'm a huge fan of the Cheryl Harris 93 article, right? So whiteness is property, once again, it raises the question of who gets to determine what is educationally purposeful, a term that student engagement researchers often use. The most cited student engagement pioneers are all white. They decided which experiences and activities add value to a college student's experience. They are unlikely familiar with particular activities and practices in which minoritized students are engaged that bolster their sense of belonging and keep them and their same race peers engaged and retained. And in the book, we talk about my notion of peer pedagogies. Peer pedagogies are students of color teaching other students of color about the realities of race on campus and the skills necessary to survive racist institutional settings. So in the book, Lori and I and Jessica say that peer pedagogies are educationally purposeful in that students who employ them often do so with an explicit purpose of retaining their peers. This form of engagement also confers onto student teachers a sense of importance because they recognize how collective success of their community depends on them. Notwithstanding, student engagement surveys do not measure peer pedagogies. Researchers also have not considered how the burden of this work, so the burden of students of color teaching other students of color how to survive, we've not measured this in student engagement surveys, and we have not sort of determined how doing this work takes away from other forms of engagement that have been privileged as being educationally purposeful. So there's a whole lot there. I just talked a whole bunch. So I'm gonna go to Dimitri for a question for Lori and I from Google Hangout.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
All right. So the first one is from it just looks like a username, but it asks, and this is just to clear up some confusion. So it says Dr. Harper explained his use of the term minoritized population in Module 1. Dr. Davis has used the term marginalized today. Can those 2 terms be used interchangeably? So just asking for some clarification on the terms marginalized and minoritized, and are those 2 things the same, and can they be used interchangeably when referring to people of color, students of color?
Lori?
I think they sort of communicate the same sentiment that within particular context, individuals of color are treated in ways that are, you know, that tend to dehumanize them or place them in positions where they are treated as less than. So whether you're on the margins or treated as a quote-unquote minority in a particular given situation, I think the impact is the same.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. And then there's about 4 questions. You all have talked a lot today about not just using, you know, CRT in a one-off way, but really being committed to it in your work. And so I think some of the viewers have extended that and have questions around what does a CRT praxis look like? How do you operationalize CRT not only in your research but also in your social justice? And so Gina Brown Carlson asks, what is your advice to those who have a goal of becoming a contributor to the field of social justice and racial equity? Should the primary activities focus on presenting at conferences, publishing and writing books? What are other critical tasks? And I like the latter part of the question. So what are critical tasks that aspiring scholars can think about as we think about not just using CRT in a one-off way?
So for those of you who are teaching, I think there are ways to use critical race theory to sort of frame how you teach, what you teach. In the example that Sean gave from the chapter, he talked about, students having material where all of the authors are white. How do you diversify the authorship and ensure that there is diverse representation for what students are reading? That's if you could be teaching a graduate level course, you could be teaching a University 101 course, but how do you? But there are ways to purposefully get students in these settings to be thinking about racism on campus. It could be. I think it can play, or it should play out in your personal life. It might be a matter of. So how do I put? So in sometimes it might require you educating family members who have certain ways of understanding things and helping to offer a different perspective. So it could happen through a conversation. Social media is huge. As you know, you all are seeing this, via Google Hangouts. So, writing a blog and sharing it with others, could be another way. I think when you work so hard to incorporate things into your life, it becomes, a natural thing. So with my children, I think about, how to help them understand race and racism, even at this young age, because I don't want them to get sucker punched. You understand? So, I think it's really about being thoughtful and incorporating it into how you approach anything. So it doesn't have to just be work related with scholarship and research and all of that, but it should also easily translate beyond the work environment into, the personal actions in which you engage every day.
Yeah, I agree. One has to be a critical race scholar, and I would even argue a critical race person everywhere that person goes, to really do this with a sense of authenticity and with a sense of praxis, right, and a commitment to praxis. I thought that Lori just gave some really spectacular examples. Do we have another question, Will, from Twitter or Facebook?
Yes, we sure do. We have a question from the user Nappy Root. They're asking about incorporating CRT into their dissertation topic. Nappy Root asks, how can I incorporate critical race theory in my topic? And the topic is, why aren't more males attending post-secondary institutions?
I would say that question demands a structural analysis, that it cannot be an analysis that simply pathologizes communities of color and schools that educate these young men. Laura, you were going to jump in?
I would say maybe rephrasing the question to be, why are more institutions recruiting and attracting men of color?
Absolutely.
So I think the onus is not simply on men to go to college, but what are institutions doing to get them there? If they claim to value diversity and want a diverse student population and want to give this great education, then what are the efforts? What do they look like to get these men there?
Yeah, Lori, I'm glad that you said that, right? Because many questions about minoritized persons tend to be framed in ways that put sort of the onus on us for not being represented or not succeeding and so on. So even in the student engagement literature, right, again, the question is most often, why are women of color not as engaged as white women, right? As opposed to asking, why aren't institutions doing a better job of engaging women of color in particular experiences and so on. So I thought that was really, really helpful reframing. I like the question that was just that you just read, Will. Lori and I invite others of you we have a slide here. What are some research topics that you have, either your dissertations or other projects, that seemingly have nothing to do with race, and you're wanting some perspective on how CRT may or may not be useful? So, continue to send those in. We're going to shift here, and Lori is going to walk us through this next set of slides, which I think are either 7 or 9 points that move us toward a critical race research agenda. Dimitri?
Before that transition, can I ask, because there's been one that's been asked for a while that I think hits it, and I've been waiting for this, and so it's from Carly Rife, and they ask, can you speak to the interactions of race and power more broadly in studying inequality in higher education using organizational theory? Often considerations of agency and power are absent in foundational organizational theory. So I think it speaks to, similar to the student development theory critique that Lori laid. A lot of the organizational theories in which higher education is grounded on don't really tend to race. So what are your perspectives on organizational theory and agency and power?
I'm trying to make sure I fully understand the question. Are they saying that some of these theories deal with agency and power but don't specifically name race, or that none of these things are present in?
That none of these things are present in the foundational organizational theories.
So I'll give an example of how I've tried to deal with that. In a study that Jessica and Harris and I were working on, we wanted to get a better understanding of how directors of Black cultural centers were incorporating intersectionality into their work, and how were they grappling with the fact that they were race-specific centers, but also being pushed to broaden their mission. So how do you maintain the fact that you're a Black cultural center, but being pushed to do all of these other things that seemingly move you away from your mission? And where does intersectionality play in that? And so with that particular study, we used Albert and Whiten's theory of organizational identity. Mm-hmm. So the thing that is true about your organization that stands the test of time regardless of what happens. So for a cultural center, that might be, we're Black, we deal with Black students, Black issues, and so on and so forth. But the theory itself does not grapple with structural racism and, politics of racism and power. And so we talk about the limitations of that theory, and then talk about critical race theory and intersectionality. But on the same hand, we also talk about intersectionality, and that it doesn't specifically talk about higher education organizations. And so that's where Albert and Whiten's theory was helpful to sort of bring some language around organizations. So I don't think it's a matter of sort of dismissing those theories. Like, I don't believe we need to dismiss student development theories. I think it's about sharing the theory, its value, but also being willing to critique the theory for the limitations that it has. So there are relevant organizational theories that help us to understand higher education. But then there are other theories and ideas like critical race theory, and there are other frameworks as well that you need to just sort of really provide a more nuanced understanding of, these issues of race and power and agency and how they play out in organizations.
Great, thank you.
Great. All right, Professor Davis, we only have 6 minutes left for you to walk us through what a critical race research agenda looks like.
Okay, I will be quick. Hopefully there'll be time for at least maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So at the end of the chapter, we talk about a critical race research agenda, and the first thing is that it explicitly commits to examining racism, white supremacy, and power as they emerge in every aspect of the research process. So from generating the idea to constructing the research question, the methodology selected, interpretation of data, data collection, how the researcher positions themselves in the work, and so on. The agenda is framed by critical questions that foreground the experiences of people of color, and understands that there's a diversity among these people, so it's not just a monolithic group. Critical race research agenda encourages researchers to purposefully explore the racialized histories that shape present-day issues and problems in higher education. So with any topic that you're doing, I think it's important to provide a historical perspective, a critical historical perspective. This type of agenda acknowledges that while racism may be centered, it operates in concert with other forms of oppression that contribute to differential racialization of various groups. It asserts that there is no such thing as objective or neutral research, and Sean and I have touched on that several times. The agenda addresses the implications for research findings and their interpretation in relation to institutional, state, and federal educational policy. So thinking about implications for policy is really important in higher ed. The next, I don't see the next, okay. A critical race research agenda is committed to action for social justice. So research isn't just done for the sake of doing research or just to explore, but it's really about making an impact or making a difference or contributing some knowledge that might promote equitable educational outcomes and can be applied in real world situations. And then a critical race research agenda is not only situated in the researcher's field of study, but expands to incorporate interdisciplinary perspectives. So if many of you who are listening are in the field of higher education, looking at other fields beyond higher education and bringing in those ideas to sort of support the work that you're doing and make it critical is important. And then
Lori, can I jump in on this one real fast?
Yes, absolutely.
I think people can hear me but not see me. But yeah, that we've advocated a lot throughout this conversation, you and I, that people, look into other fields. But even looking within our own field of education and looking at the wonderful K-12 critical race work that's been produced by Latson Billings and Tate and many others that are too numerous to name in our last 3 minutes here. But yeah, lots of great critical race scholarship has been produced in K-12.
And then finally, a critical race research agenda disrupts dominant paradigms within research by engaging in explicit reinterpretation of those ideas to provide audiences with a new perspective. So I think that point really touches on, the questions we ask. If you think about the question that you're trying to ask for your research, how might you reframe it to get at, these issues of power and racism and reinterpreting your ideas so that they more closely align with critical race theory.
Great. Thanks, Lori. Will, give us a question.
Yes, so we have a really good question from a user by the name of Dr. Weedle to be. Dr. Weedle to be asks, how can the use of critical race theory for policy analysis in higher ed be expanded beyond desegregation?
So we are not going to answer at Dr. Weedle to be's question, but in lieu of a response, we're going to give her a prize. So if you were one of the persons who got your question posed today, you will get a free copy of the book by Ana Martinez Aleman, Brian Plusser, and Estela Ben-Simon. Our really good friends at Johns Hopkins University Press have agreed to donate complimentary copies of the book to some folks who participated in this module. So if yours was one of the questions that we engaged on air, send us your name and mailing addresses to the center's email account. It's equity@gse.upenn.edu, including at Dr. Weedle to be, and we will send you Johns Hopkins University Press will send you a free copy of the book. Lori and I would like to conclude this module by thanking you all for taking time to join us. And certainly we want to thank Professors Martinez-Alamán, Pusser, and Ben-Simon for providing us space in their book to share these ideas. If you've not gotten Critical Approaches to the Study of Higher Education, we highly encourage you to do so. It is an excellent text. In addition to our chapter, there are 12 others written by some really, really prominent scholars in our field: Sylvia Hurtado, Mitchell Chang, Ana Martinez-Alamán, Robert Teranishi, Anna Newman, and many, many others. So it is definitely a book worth purchasing. So we encourage you to get it. We think that it works really well in concert with the ideas that Lori and I have put forward in this particular module. And we do want to thank Greg Britton at Johns Hopkins University Press for donating books. Lori, any final words of wisdom?
Not words of wisdom, but I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in the Institute. It's been a great experience, and I hope that it's been helpful for those who have participated in the listening audience.
Well, thank you so much for your wisdom and your great friendship and colleagueship, and definitely thank you for introducing me to CRT and introducing hundreds of others around the country to CRT through what I hope to has been a really helpful module. We invite you all to join us for the final module in this series this Thursday. Dimitri Morgan, Ed Smith, and Jaleel Bishop, who's a PhD student at UCLA, will join us for that final module. Thank you all so much for taking time to join Lori and me for this module on using critical race theory and methods.